The whisper of desperation. The hum of the fluorescent lights cast a soft, sterile glow over the roadside diner. It was a quiet, unassuming place nestled on the edge of a two-lane highway that stretched into oblivion. Late-night truckers, weary travelers, and locals seeking comfort food filled its booths most evenings. Tonight, though, the diner was unusually empty. Sergeant Aaron Blake sat in his corner booth, his uniform subtly identifying him as law enforcement. He sipped his coffee, flipping through a notepad filled with his day's notes. This was his ritual, a moment of calm after a shift filled with the unpredictability of life as a cop. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly, breaking the silence. Aaron looked up, his trained eyes instinctively taking in the newcomers. A man entered, his hand resting firmly on the shoulder of a young girl. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, her frail figure swallowed by an oversized pink hoodie. The man smiled broadly, his teeth too white, his demeanor too polished. "Come on, sweetie," the man said, his voice carrying a rehearsed cheerfulness. "Let's get you those pancakes you love." The girl's steps were slow, deliberate, almost reluctant. Her shoulders hunched forward, her eyes cast downward, avoiding contact with anyone in the room. Aaron's instincts prickled. Years of experience taught him to notice the little things: the rigid posture, the unnatural quiet of a child, the way her tiny hands fidgeted with the hem of her hoodie. They slid into a booth near the center of the diner. The man ordered for both of them, his voice overly animated as he described their fun daddy-daughter road trip. The waitress, oblivious to the undertones, smiled and took their order, returning a moment later with coffee for the man and a plate of chocolate chip pancakes for the girl. The man reached across the table, ruffling the girl's hair. She flinched, a movement so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. But Aaron saw it. His jaw tightened slightly as he took another sip of coffee, keeping his eyes on them from his corner. The girl wasn't eating. Instead, she sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her fork untouched beside her plate. "Eat up, princess," the man encouraged, his tone saccharine. The girl's fingers trembled as she finally picked up the fork, cutting a small piece of pancake and bringing it to her mouth mechanically. Aaron shifted in his seat, pretending to glance casually around the room. He noticed how the man's hand never left the table. It rested too purposefully, as if ready to act at a moment's notice. His smile remained, but it didn't reach his eyes. A few minutes later, the man stood. "Excuse me for a second, sweetheart. Daddy needs to use the restroom," he said, patting her shoulder before walking away. His shoes clicked against the linoleum floor as he disappeared down the hall. The moment he was out of sight, the girl's demeanor changed. Her eyes darted around the diner, frantic and searching. Finally, they landed on Aaron. Something about his calm presence, his uniform, gave her courage. She slid out of her booth, her small frame trembling as she approached him. Aaron leaned forward, keeping his expression neutral but his senses on high alert. The girl stopped beside his table, her gaze flitting nervously toward the restroom. "This man," her voice was barely a whisper, her words shaky but urgent. "This man isn't my dad." The words hit Aaron like a freight train. He placed his coffee cup down slowly, his eyes meeting hers. Her desperation was palpable, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were her lifeline. Before Aaron could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The girl froze, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly retreated to her booth, resuming her earlier stiff posture. The man returned, his smile plastered back in place as he slid into the seat across from her. His gaze briefly met Aaron's, a flicker of something cold and calculating passing through his eyes. Aaron forced himself to remain calm, though his mind raced. He had to handle this carefully. One wrong move could escalate the situation, putting the girl in even more danger. The man leaned forward, his tone syrupy sweet. "You didn't touch your pancakes yet, sweetheart. Don't you like them?" The girl's hand trembled as she picked up her fork again, cutting another small piece. Aaron noted how her movements were robotic, as if following an invisible script dictated by fear. Aaron cleared his throat softly, making sure his voice carried across the room without drawing too much attention. "Those pancakes do look good," he said warmly, directing his words toward the girl. "My daughter loves the chocolate chip ones too." The girl's eyes flickered toward him, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through her fear. The man's smile tightened, his jaw clenching slightly. "What's your name, sweetie?" Aaron asked, his tone casual. "Lila," she whispered, her voice stronger this time. "That's a pretty name," Aaron said, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you enjoying your pancakes, Lila?" Before the man could intervene, Lila blurted out the words in a barely audible whisper, her eyes locking with Aaron's. "He took me from a park 2 days ago." Aaron's heart pounded. He kept his expression neutral, but every nerve in his body was on high alert. The man's facade faltered for a split second, his jaw tightening as he shifted in his seat. "Kids and their imaginations," the man said with a forced chuckle, his eyes narrowing slightly, "always coming up with the wildest stories." Aaron nodded, his face betraying nothing. "Imagination's a wonderful thing," he said, reaching casually for his phone on the table. His hand brushed against the radio clipped to his belt, and with practiced ease, he pressed the button to signal dispatch. 10:23, he said quietly, his lips barely moving. "Joey's Diner on Route 7. Possible 207A involving a juvenile. Request immediate assistance. Plainclothes approach." The response crackled in his earpiece, muffled enough to remain unnoticed. Aaron's pulse steadied slightly. Help was on the way. "So," Aaron said, his tone light, "are you folks just passing through?" The man's fingers drummed against the table, his smile fixed but strained. "Just a quick stop," he said. "Got a long drive ahead." Aaron nodded again, his movements deliberate and calm. His eyes never left the man, who was now visibly tense, his right hand disappearing beneath the table. The calm of the diner was deceptive, masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Aaron knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let this man leave with Lila. Not tonight. Not ever. A predator's mask slips. The air in the diner felt heavier. The quiet hum of the jukebox now a backdrop to the silent battle playing out between Aaron and the man. Sergeant Aaron Blake's outward demeanor remained composed, but his mind worked rapidly. Each gesture, each flicker of emotion, told him more about the man across the room. This wasn't an impulsive abduction, it was calculated. The man was playing a part, trying to project an image of a loving father, but the cracks in his performance were growing larger. Aaron leaned back in his booth, his eyes casually scanning the room. The man, who had introduced himself as Lila's dad, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His right hand, now concealed beneath the table, betrayed his growing anxiety. Lila sat frozen, her small frame stiff, her trembling hands gripping the edge of her plate. The tension between them was almost palpable. Aaron broke the silence with a warm, disarming smile. "Chocolate chip pancakes at night. Can't go wrong with that. You know my daughter swears by them. Says they're the best thing in the world." Lila glanced at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The man's smile tightened again, his eyes darting toward the door before snapping back to Aaron. "Yeah, well," the man said, his voice strained. "Kids love their sweets, don't they?" His tone lacked the casual ease of a loving parent. Instead, it carried an edge, like someone trying too hard to seem natural. Aaron knew the type well. He'd seen it in interrogations, the way a suspect would overcompensate when lying, their words rehearsed, their smiles too wide. "You folks on a road trip?" Aaron asked, keeping his tone light, as if making small talk. His hands rested on the table, but his muscles were coiled, ready to act. The man hesitated, his mind clearly racing. "Yeah, just me and my girl," he said, forcing another smile. "Thought we'd hit the road and make some memories. Isn't that right, Princess?" He reached out to pat Lila's hand, but she flinched visibly. The gesture was quick, almost imperceptible, but Aaron caught it. He also noticed how the man's hand lingered just a little too long, a subtle reminder of control. "That's nice," Aaron said, nodding. "Where you headed?" "Family up north," the man said quickly, his words too rehearsed. "It's a bit of a drive, but you know how it is, family's family." Aaron nodded again, his expression neutral. He allowed the silence to stretch, knowing it would make the man uncomfortable. Sure enough, the man shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. "Actually," Aaron said after a beat, "I know the area pretty well. Maybe I could recommend some places to stop along the way." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's kind of you," he said, his tone now tinged with suspicion. "But we're on a tight schedule." Aaron noted how the man's body language became more defensive. His posture stiffened, and his eyes darted to the door again. It was a subtle but clear sign. He was planning an exit. Lila, meanwhile, sat frozen. Her pancakes were untouched, her hands trembling slightly as they rested in her lap. Aaron caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "You seem pretty interested in us, officer," the man said suddenly, his voice sharper. The forced friendliness was gone, replaced by a thinly veiled hostility. "What's with all the questions?" Aaron smiled calmly, leaning back in his seat. "Just making conversation," he said. "Small-town hospitality, you know." The man didn't respond. His fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the table, his eyes flicking toward the restroom hallway. Aaron followed his gaze subtly. The restroom led to a side exit. If the man bolted, it was likely where he'd go. Aaron's radio crackled softly in his earpiece, a signal that backup was close. He felt a surge of relief but kept his composure. The man didn't know help was on the way, and Aaron intended to keep it that way. For now, his priority was keeping the man from panicking. "You know," Aaron said conversationally, "Lila reminds me of my daughter when she was her age. She always loved road trips, especially the part where we'd stop for pancakes." Lila glanced at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Aaron could see she was on the verge of breaking down. He needed to act soon. The man's forced smile returned, but his eyes were cold. "That's nice," he said flatly, "but I think we'll be hitting the road soon." Aaron nodded, his hand brushing casually against the radio on his belt. He pressed the button twice, a silent signal to dispatch that the suspect might attempt to flee. Just then, the waitress approached, holding a pot of coffee. "Refill?" she asked cheerfully, oblivious to the tension at the table. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Sure," he said, forcing a smile. As the waitress poured his coffee, Aaron took the opportunity to subtly reposition himself. He shifted in his seat, angling his body so he had a clear line of sight to the side exit. The waitress turned to Lila. "How about you, sweetheart? Need anything else?" Lila shook her head quickly, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "All right then," the waitress said, walking away. The moment she was out of earshot, the man leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Eat your pancakes, Lila," he hissed, his earlier cheerfulness gone. Aaron's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. His gaze flicked to the window, where he spotted the faint glow of red and blue lights approaching in the distance. Backup was seconds away. "So," Aaron said, his tone light, "you must be in a hurry if you're traveling this late. Long drive ahead." The man didn't respond. Instead, he pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We should get going," he said, his voice tense. Lila froze, her eyes wide with fear. Aaron stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He positioned himself between the man and the side exit, his expression calm but firm. "In a rush?" Aaron asked, his tone casual. "You should probably finish your coffee first. Wouldn't want to waste it." The man's eyes narrowed. "What's your deal, officer?" he said, his voice low and threatening. "You've been watching us since we walked in. Why don't you mind your own business?" Aaron met his gaze steadily. "It's my business to keep people safe," he said. "Especially kids." For a moment, the diner was silent. Then the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the tension. The man's head snapped toward the window, his eyes widening as he saw the flashing lights. "What the hell?" he started, but Aaron cut him off. "Lila, come here," Aaron said, his voice firm but gentle. Lila hesitated, her eyes darting between Aaron and the man. The man reached for her arm, but Aaron was faster. He stepped forward, blocking the man's path. "Don't," Aaron said, his voice cold and commanding. The man's face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're getting into," he snarled. "I know enough," Aaron replied, his hand resting on the holster at his belt. "Now sit down." The man didn't move. For a moment, Aaron thought he might bolt, but then the diner's door burst open, and two plainclothes officers entered, their weapons drawn. "Freeze," one of them barked. The man's face contorted in fury, but he raised his hand slowly. As the officers moved to handcuff him, Aaron turned to Lila, who was shaking but unharmed. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise." Through the window, the man's face was pressed against the glass of the squad car, his eyes still burning with hatred. But Aaron didn't care. For the first time that night, he felt a weight lift from his chest. Lila was safe, and that was all that mattered. Lila hesitated, her eyes darting between Aaron and the man as chaos threatened to unfold around them. The fear in her eyes was raw and unfiltered, and Aaron knew he had to act carefully to keep the situation from escalating. The two plainclothes officers who had entered the diner moved swiftly, their faces set in grim determination. The man, still standing near the booth, clenched his fists as if weighing his options. Aaron spoke again, his voice calm but commanding. "Lila, come here. It's okay." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of authority and reassurance that cut through the noise of her fear. Lila took a trembling step forward, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the table for support. The man's gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment, Aaron saw something dark and dangerous in his eyes, an anger barely restrained. "Stay where you are, Lila," the man said sharply, his tone no longer pretending to be warm or caring. It was an order, and it made Aaron's blood run cold. Aaron stepped closer, his body a shield between the man and the girl. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice steady. "It's over." The man's lip curled into a sneer, and he glanced toward the side exit again. "You think you've got this all figured out, don't you, officer? But you don't know anything." Aaron held his ground, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He hoped it wouldn't come to that, but he was prepared for anything. "I know enough," he said. "I know you're not her father. I know you've been lying since the moment you walked in here. And I know that you're not walking out of here with her." The man's eyes narrowed, his body tense as if ready to bolt. One of the plainclothes officers, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped closer. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he warned. "Hands where we can see them." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The diner was silent except for the faint hum of the jukebox and the nervous shuffling of the few patrons who had remained seated, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, the man lunged for Lila. Aaron reacted instantly. He stepped forward, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back with practiced precision. The man let out a grunt of pain but didn't stop struggling, his movements wild and desperate. Aaron held firm, his grip unyielding. "Stop resisting," Aaron barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The other officers moved in quickly, helping Aaron subdue the man. Together, they forced him to the ground, his face pressed against the cold linoleum floor, A pair of handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, and the fight left his body as he realized he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Lila stood frozen a few feet away, her eyes wide with shock. One of the officers approached her cautiously, kneeling down to her level. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Aaron straightened, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He looked down at the man, who glared up at him with a mixture of hatred and defiance. "You have no idea what you've just done," the man spat. "This isn't over." Aaron ignored him. He turned his attention to Lila, who was trembling but unharmed. He crouched down in front of her, his expression softening. "Lila," he said gently, "are you hurt?" She shook her head, but tears spilled down her cheeks. Aaron felt a pang of sadness as he realized just how terrified she must have been. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "You're safe now," he said again, his voice firm but kind. "I promise." Outside, the flashing lights of the police vehicles illuminated the diner's parking lot. More officers had arrived, and the man was led out in handcuffs, his protests falling on deaf ears. Aaron stood and watched as the man was loaded into the back of a squad car, his threats still echoing in Aaron's mind. Back inside the diner, the tension began to dissipate. The patrons who had been hiding started to emerge from their booths, their faces a mixture of relief and curiosity. The waitress who had served the man and Lila approached cautiously, her eyes filled with concern. "Is she okay?" the waitress asked, her voice trembling slightly. Aaron nodded. "She will be," he said. "Thanks to all of you for staying calm." The waitress glanced at Lila, who was now sitting in a nearby booth with one of the officers. She looked small and fragile, her shoulders hunched as she clutched a cup of hot chocolate the waitress had brought her. Aaron stepped outside, needing a moment to clear his head. The night air was cool and refreshing, and he took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the image of Lila's terrified face. One of the officers approached him, a clipboard in hand. "We'll take him to the station and start processing," the officer said. "Do you want to handle the interview?" Aaron nodded. "Yeah, I want to make sure we get everything we can out of him." The officer hesitated. "And the girl?" Aaron glanced back at the diner, where he could see Lila through the window. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and yet there was a strength in her that he couldn't ignore. She had found the courage to speak up, to trust him, and that had made all the difference. "She'll need someone from Child Protective Services," Aaron said. "But first, I want to hear her story. She deserves to be heard." The officer nodded and walked away, leaving Aaron alone with his thoughts. He knew this was just the beginning. There would be paperwork, interviews, and likely a lengthy investigation into who the man really was and how he had come to abduct Lila. But for now, Aaron allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had done his job, and Lila was safe. And that, he thought, was all that mattered. Lila's truth. Inside the police station, the fluorescent lights seemed harsher than those of the diner, illuminating every corner of the room in sterile brightness. Lila sat on a plush, brightly colored chair in a child-friendly interview room designed to make young victims feel safe. The walls were adorned with cheerful murals of animals and rainbows, but the girl's expression remained clouded with fear and exhaustion. Her hands clutched a small cup of juice, her fingers trembling slightly. Sergeant Aaron Blake sat across from her, his notepad untouched for now. He wanted to build trust before asking her anything difficult. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and offered her a warm smile. "You're doing great, Lila," he said gently. "I know this is all a little scary, but you're safe now. Nobody can hurt you here." Lila nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the cup in her hands. Aaron waited, giving her the time she needed. Rushing her wouldn't help. She had already shown immense bravery, and he wasn't about to push her further than she could handle. After a long moment, Lila spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Is he gone?" Aaron's smile faded slightly, and he leaned closer to meet her gaze. Yes, he's gone. He's at the station now, and we're going to make sure he can't hurt you or anyone else ever again. She looked up at him for the first time, her wide brown eyes searching his face for confirmation. Slowly, her grip on the juice cup loosened, and she placed it on the small table between them. I didn't know what to do, she admitted, her voice trembling. I was so scared. You did exactly the right thing, Aaron reassured her. You were so brave, Lila. Telling me what you did might have saved your life. Her lips quivered, and tears began to spill down her cheeks. Aaron grabbed a box of tissues from a nearby shelf and placed it in front of her. She took one and dabbed at her eyes. I was at the park, she began, her voice shaking but growing stronger as she continued. It was just me and my mom. She was sitting on the bench, watching me play. I love the blue slide. It's my favorite. Aaron nodded, encouraging her to go on. I was climbing up the slide when he came over. He said his name was Victor. He had a dog with him. A big, fluffy one. He said the dog was friendly and that I could pet him. Her voice broke slightly, and she clutched the tissue tighter. I didn't think anything bad would happen. What happened next? Aaron asked, his tone careful and even. Lila took a shaky breath. He said the dog was thirsty and needed water. He asked if I could help him get some from the fountain. I didn't want to go, but he smiled, and he seemed nice. So I went. Her small frame seemed to shrink into the chair as she recounted the events. Aaron's chest tightened with anger, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't the time for his emotions to show. He took my hand and led me to his car. The dog was in the back seat, wagging his tail. I thought we were just getting water, but then he opened the car door and he pushed me inside. Her words came faster now, tumbling out in a rush. I screamed, but he closed the door and told me to be quiet. He said if I didn't, he'd hurt my mom. Aaron's heart broke at her words. He wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of physical comfort, but he held back, letting her set the pace. What happened after that? He asked softly. He drove away. I didn't know where we were going. He kept talking, telling me to call him Dad. He said if I didn't do what he said, nobody would ever find me again. Her tears flowed freely now, and she buried her face in her hands. Aaron waited, letting her process the emotions flooding out of her. It's okay, Lila, he said after a moment. You don't have to say any more if you're not ready. No, she said quickly, lowering her hands. I need to tell you. Aaron nodded, silently admiring her strength. He took me to a motel, she continued. It was small and dirty. He made me stay in the room all day. I wasn't allowed to talk to anyone, not even the people at the front desk. He told them I was his daughter, and that we were on vacation. Aaron clenched his jaw, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He forced himself to stay calm, for Lila's sake. I tried to escape once, she said, her voice trembling. When he went to get food, I unlocked the door and ran down the hall. But he caught me before I could get outside. He was so mad. He said if I tried that again, I'd never see my mom again. Her breathing grew ragged, and she clutched the edge of the table for support. Aaron reached out slowly, placing his hand over hers. You're safe now, Lila, he said firmly. You're so brave for telling me this. I promise we'll find your mom, and we'll make sure you're never in danger again. Lila nodded, her tears slowing as she drew strength from his words. What happened when you got to the diner? Aaron asked gently, wanting to fill in the gaps. He told me to act normal, she said. He said if I told anyone the truth, they wouldn't believe me. But when I saw you, I thought maybe you could help. You looked safe. Aaron felt a lump rise in his throat. He swallowed hard, his determination solidifying. Lila had taken a huge risk by approaching him, and he wouldn't let her down. You did the right thing, he said, You're safe now, and we're going to take care of you." The door to the interview room opened, and a woman from Child Protective Services stepped inside, her expression kind but professional. Aaron stood, giving Lila a reassuring smile. "This is Miss Harper," he said. "She's going to make sure you're looked after while we find your mom." Lila looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You won't leave, will you?" Aaron crouched down to her level again. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "I'll be here every step of the way." As Miss Harper led Lila out of the room, Aaron felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He would find out everything he could about Victor Kane, and he would make sure the man paid for what he had done. But more than that, he would do everything in his power to reunite Lila with her family and give her the peace she so desperately needed. Because that's what justice was all about. The web unravels. Sergeant Aaron Blake returned to his desk, the weight of Lila's story pressing heavily on his shoulders. The police station was buzzing with activity, the hum of voices and ringing phones creating a chaotic symphony. Despite the noise, Aaron's focus was razor-sharp. The name Victor Kane sat in bold letters at the top of his notepad, circled twice. He had dealt with predators before, but something about this man, his polished demeanor, his calculated lies, made Aaron's gut churn. Kane wasn't just an opportunist. He was methodical, and that made him dangerous. Aaron opened his laptop and began typing Victor Kane's name into every law enforcement database he had access to. The preliminary search yielded nothing, which wasn't surprising. If Kane was as experienced as he appeared, he likely used aliases. Aaron expanded his search parameters, cross-referencing missing children reports, witness statements, and motel check-ins across neighboring states. The first lead came in the form of a motel receipt. The night manager at the rundown establishment where Lila had been held had confirmed Kane's stay. Aaron examined the receipt, noting the fake name he had used, Daniel Green. He forwarded the information to his colleagues in the cybercrime unit, asking them to trace the payment method. It was a start, but Aaron knew it wasn't enough. Predators like Kane didn't leave trails unless they were careless, and Kane didn't strike him as careless. Aaron stood and headed toward the interrogation rooms, where Kane was being held. The suspect sat alone in a cold, windowless room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. Despite his disheveled appearance, Kane's expression was one of smug defiance. His earlier threats echoed in Aaron's mind. This isn't over. Aaron pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind him. He placed a file on the table and sat down, his eyes locked on Kane's. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair as much as the handcuffs would allow. Well, Kane drawled. "Here to play good cop or bad cop." Aaron didn't take the bait. He opened the file and slid a photograph across the table. An image of Lila, taken earlier that night. Her wide eyes and trembling frame were frozen in time, a haunting reminder of what she had endured. "Tell me about Lila," Aaron said, his voice calm but firm. Kane's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "What's there to tell? She's my daughter." Aaron leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "We both know that's not true. Lila told us everything. How you lured her away from her mother at the park. How you threatened her. How you held her against her will. She's just a child, Kane." Kane's expression darkened, but he didn't respond. Aaron continued, his voice growing colder. "You're facing charges for kidnapping, child endangerment, and more. If you cooperate, maybe the DA will consider going easier on you. But if you don't, I promise you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell." For a moment, Kane said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his shackled hands clinking against the metal table. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won because you've got me in here, but this is bigger than me. You can lock me up, but you'll never stop what's coming." Aaron's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Kane chuckled, the sound chilling in its emptiness. You'll find out soon enough. Aaron clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He stood abruptly and walked to the door, knocking twice. An officer opened it, and Aaron stepped out, leaving Kane alone with his cryptic words. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them from Kane. Not yet. Back in the main office, Aaron's phone buzzed on his desk. He picked it up, his pulse quickening when he saw the caller ID. Detective Carla Ramirez, one of the department's top cybercrime specialists. Ramirez, Aaron said as he answered. Tell me you've got something. Plenty, Ramirez replied, her voice sharp and efficient. The credit card Kane used to book the motel. It's linked to an account under yet another fake name, Mark Redmond. But here's the kicker. We traced transactions to similar aliases across multiple states, all within the last 6 months. Hotels, gas stations, even toy stores. Aaron's stomach sank. You think there are more victims? Almost certainly, Ramirez said. We're cross-referencing missing children reports with these locations now, but it's going to take time. Aaron rubbed his temples, the enormity of the situation settling over him. Kane wasn't just an isolated predator. He was part of a larger operation. The thought made his skin crawl. Let me know as soon as you find anything, he said. You'll be the first to know, Ramirez promised before hanging up. Aaron sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If Kane was part of a trafficking ring, Lila's rescue might only be the tip of the iceberg. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. He needed to know more about Kane, where he came from, who he was working with, and how many lives he had destroyed. Aaron decided to visit Lila one more time before ending his shift. She was staying in a temporary foster home under the supervision of Child Protective Services. The house was small but warm, with toys scattered across the living room floor and the faint smell of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. Lila was curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal. She looked up when Aaron entered, her expression wary but less frightened than before. Hi, Lila, Aaron said softly, sitting down on the edge of the coffee table. How are you holding up? She shrugged, her small fingers picking at the fur of the stuffed animal. Okay, I guess. Aaron smiled gently. I wanted to tell you that we're still working on finding your mom. It might take a little while, but we won't stop until we do. Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded. Thank you. Aaron hesitated, then asked, Lila, do you remember if Victor, if the man, ever talked about other kids? Did he mention any names or places? Lila's brow furrowed as she thought. He was on the phone a lot, she said slowly. He talked about going to different places, but I didn't understand most of it. He said they were waiting for me. Aaron's stomach turned. Who's they? I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But he said I was special, and they were going to pay him a lot of money. Aaron's blood ran cold. He reached out and gently squeezed her hand. You've helped us so much, Lila. We're going to stop him. And we're going to stop them, too. As he left the foster home that night, Aaron's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Lila anymore. It was about every child Kane and his network had harmed or intended to harm. And Aaron wouldn't rest until they were brought to justice. The web was beginning to unravel, and Aaron was determined to follow every thread to its end. Aaron returned to the station, his mind racing. Lila's revelation about them waiting for her had confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just an isolated abduction. It was part of something far more sinister. He walked briskly to his desk, grabbed the phone, and called Detective Carla Ramirez again. Ramirez, Aaron said, his voice clipped. Lila just gave me something big. Kane isn't working alone. She overheard him talking about others waiting for her, likely buyers. There was a brief pause on the other end. When Ramirez spoke, her voice was grim. That lines up with what I'm seeing. I flagged several transactions linked to his aliases. They're small, gas stations, fast food joints, but the locations tell a story. It's a route, Aaron. He's been moving. Moving where? Aaron asked, though he already suspected the answer. Toward a central location, Ramirez replied. I cross-referenced the last few motel stays with missing children reports. 3 kids reported missing in the last 2 months were last seen near places Kane stayed. All of them were around Lila's age. Aaron felt a cold knot in his stomach. Do we know where they were taken? Not yet, Ramirez said, frustration lacing her words. But here's the thing. All the transactions end in the same city, Albion. Albion was a small, industrial town about 2 hours from their current location. It was known for its sprawling warehouses and shipping yards, perfect for someone looking to hide illegal activities. I'm heading there, Aaron said decisively. I figured you'd say that, Ramirez replied. I'm sending the addresses of the warehouses in the area. Most are abandoned, but a few are still in operation. I'll keep digging on my end. Thanks, Ramirez, Aaron said, hanging up. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, calling out to one of his colleagues on the way. Get a team ready. We're going to Albion. The drive to Albion was tense, the night's events playing over and over in Aaron's mind. His radio crackled intermittently as his team coordinated their approach. They weren't taking any chances. If Kane was part of a trafficking ring, they had to assume the others involved would be armed and dangerous. Aaron's car pulled up to the edge of Albion's industrial district just as dawn began to break. The warehouses loomed like hulking shadows against the pale light, their corrugated metal walls reflecting the faint glow. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and rust, and the distant sound of machinery echoed faintly. Ramirez's information had narrowed their focus to a cluster of 3 warehouses on the edge of the district. 2 were marked as abandoned, but the third showed recent activity. Electricity usage, security camera installations, and truck deliveries late at night. Aaron parked his car a block away and met with the team. Officers in tactical gear were already assembled, their faces set with determination. Aaron outlined the plan quickly but thoroughly. This is our primary target, he said, pointing to the warehouse marked active. We have reason to believe it's being used for trafficking. Our priority is the safety of any potential victims inside. Move fast, move carefully, and watch each other's backs. The team nodded, their expressions grim. Aaron led the way as they approached the warehouse under cover of darkness. The building was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, but a rusted gate hung loosely, providing easy access. Aaron signaled for silence as they moved in. The sound of a generator hummed faintly from inside the building, and through a crack in the wall, Aaron spotted movement, shadows shifting against the pale light of industrial floodlamps. He raised his hand, signaling the team to take positions around the building. 2 officers moved to cover the back exit, while others prepared to breach the front door. Aaron took a deep breath, his pulse steady but quickened by adrenaline. On my mark, he whispered into his radio. 3, 2, 1. The front door burst open with a deafening crash, the tactical team flooding in with weapons drawn. Aaron followed close behind, his eyes scanning the room. The warehouse was a sprawling open space filled with crates and stacks of pallets. A makeshift office sat in one corner, its windows glowing with artificial light. Police, hands in the air, one of the officers shouted. Chaos erupted as 2 men near the center of the warehouse bolted for the back exit. The officers stationed there intercepted them, tackling them to the ground. A third man emerged from the office, his hand reaching for something under his jacket. But Aaron was faster. He raised his weapon, his voice cutting through the noise. Don't move, he commanded. The man froze, his hand hovering above his waistband. Aaron approached cautiously, keeping his gun trained on the suspect. On the ground. Now. The man complied, dropping to his knees with his hands raised. Aaron signaled for another officer to cuff him, then turned his attention to the rest of the warehouse. Clear the crates, he ordered. Check every inch of this place. Officers moved quickly, prying open crates and searching behind stacks of pallets. Aaron's heart pounded as he approached the makeshift office. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the faint sound of voices, young, frightened voices. He pushed the door open, his stomach tightening at the sight before him. Inside, 3 children sat huddled together, their faces pale and tear-streaked. They couldn't have been older than 10. A woman stood nearby, her hands raised in surrender, her face a mask of fear. "It's okay," Aaron said softly, lowering his weapon. "We're here to help." The children stared at him, their eyes wide with disbelief. One of them, a boy with a mop of dark hair, clutched a tattered stuffed animal. The woman remained silent, her hands trembling. "Ma'am," Aaron said firmly, "step away from the kids." She hesitated, then stepped back slowly. 2 officers entered the room and moved to secure her while Aaron knelt in front of the children. "You're safe now," he said gently. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The boy with the stuffed animal looked at him with tears streaming down his face. "Are you really a cop?" he asked, his voice shaky. Aaron nodded, pulling out his badge and holding it up. "I promise, you're safe." The boy clutched the stuffed animal tighter, his tears flowing freely. "I want my mom." Aaron felt a lump rise in his throat. "We're going to find her," he said. "We're going to make sure you all get home." Hours later, as the sun rose fully over Albion, the warehouse was secured, and the suspects were in custody. Aaron stood outside, watching as the children were loaded into an ambulance to be checked out. Their faces were still pale, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes now, a glimmer of relief. Ramirez called as Aaron watched the scene unfold. "Good work, Blake," she said. "We've already identified one of the suspects as a known trafficker with ties to a larger network. This bust might just crack the whole operation wide open." Aaron exhaled deeply, the weight of the night finally catching up with him. "It's a start," he said, "but there's still more to do." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Aaron felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lila's bravery had sparked something much larger than either of them could have imagined. And now, with a network of traffickers exposed and children reunited with their families, justice had taken its first step forward. But Aaron knew the fight was far from over, and he wasn't about to stop. Unraveling the network. The arrests at the Albion warehouse marked a significant breakthrough, but Sergeant Aaron Blake knew it was only the beginning. The operation had exposed a chilling truth. Victor Kane wasn't a lone predator. He was part of a highly organized trafficking ring, and the warehouse was merely one node in a sprawling network. Aaron's determination burned brighter than ever as he prepared to dive deeper into the case. The debrief. The station's briefing room was packed with officers and detectives, the air tense with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Maps, photographs, and notes were pinned to the wall, creating a chaotic mosaic of information. Aaron stood at the front of the room, flanked by Detective Carla Ramirez and Captain Alina Monroe, the latter overseeing the task force formed to dismantle the ring. "Here's what we know so far," Aaron began, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "The suspects we arrested at the warehouse are low-level operatives. They were responsible for holding and transporting the children, but they're not the masterminds." He gestured to the map behind him, which showed a series of red pins marking locations across several states. "We've identified at least 6 other sites connected to this network. Each location corresponds with missing persons reports, primarily children under 12. The evidence suggests the operation is highly coordinated, with each site acting as a waypoint in the trafficking route." Captain Monroe stepped forward, her expression grim. "This isn't just a local issue. We're dealing with an interstate operation, possibly international. We need to move fast before they realize we've uncovered one of their hubs." Detective Ramirez took over, clicking through a presentation on the monitor. "Based on the financial trail tied to Victor Kane's aliases, we've identified 2 potential leads: a private shipping company based in the same district as the warehouse and an offshore account that's been funneling money into the network." Aaron nodded. "The shipping company is our next target. If they're involved, they're likely moving victims under the guise of legitimate cargo. We'll need to coordinate with federal agencies to shut them down. The room buzzed with murmured conversations as officers absorbed the information. Aaron felt a flicker of hope amid the overwhelming challenges. They were making progress, and every step brought them closer to justice. The warehouse clue. Later that afternoon, Aaron returned to the Albion warehouse with a small team to comb through the evidence. The building was eerily quiet, the chaotic energy of the raid replaced by a heavy stillness. Crates and pallets lay scattered across the floor, many still unopened. Aaron donned a pair of gloves and pried open one of the larger crates. Inside, he found stacks of blankets, children's toys, and sealed containers of food. It looked innocuous at first glance, but the meticulous packaging told a different story. This wasn't a random assortment of items. It was a kit designed to sustain victims during transport. "Over here," an officer called, motioning Aaron toward a stack of papers on a nearby desk. Aaron sifted through the documents, his eyes scanning for anything significant. Among the receipts and shipping manifests, one document caught his attention. A ledger filled with coded entries. Dates, initials, and cryptic symbols were scrawled in neat columns, their meaning unclear. "What do you make of this?" the officer asked, peering over Aaron's shoulder. "It's a log," Aaron said, his voice low. "But it's encrypted. This could be the key to identifying the other locations and players in the network." He carefully bagged the ledger as evidence, his mind racing with possibilities. If they could crack the code, they might uncover the full extent of the operation. The cybercrime breakthrough. That evening, Aaron met with Ramirez in the station's cybercrime lab. The room was dimly lit, the glow of multiple monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. Ramirez was hunched over her keyboard, her fingers flying as she analyzed the ledger's contents. "This is sophisticated," she muttered, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. The codes aren't random. They're tied to specific algorithms." "Can you break it?" Aaron asked, leaning against the desk. "Eventually," Ramirez replied. "But it's going to take time. Meanwhile, I did find something else. Communication logs from Kane's burner phone. Most of the messages are deleted, but I recovered fragments. There's one contact he messaged frequently, someone using the alias Cobra." "Cobra," Aaron repeated, frowning. "Sounds like someone in charge." "Exactly," Ramirez said. "The messages reference shipments and deadlines. One of the locations mentioned matches another warehouse near the state line." Aaron's jaw tightened. "Then that's our next target. The state line warehouse." By the following night, Aaron and his team were positioned outside the second warehouse. Unlike the Albion site, this one was active, with trucks coming and going under the cover of darkness. The building was surrounded by a tall fence, topped with razor wire, and security cameras dotted the perimeter. Aaron surveyed the scene through binoculars, his pulse steady despite the tension. "They're expecting to move something, or someone. Tonight," he said quietly into his radio. "We need to act fast." The tactical team moved into position, breaching the gate with precision. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the night as they approached the warehouse. Aaron led the charge, his weapon at the ready. "Police, don't move," he shouted as they stormed inside. The scene inside was chaotic. Workers scattered in all directions, some attempting to flee while others raised their hands in surrender. Aaron's team quickly secured the area, detaining everyone they could. In the corner of the warehouse, Aaron spotted a cluster of metal cages. His heart sank as he approached, his worst fears confirmed. Inside the cages were more children, their faces pale and frightened. They clung to each other, their eyes wide with terror. "It's okay," Aaron said gently, lowering his weapon. "You're safe now." Officers moved quickly to release the children, wrapping them in blankets and leading them to waiting ambulances. Aaron felt a surge of relief as he watched the kids being carried to safety, but his focus remained sharp. There was still more to uncover. A message from Cobra. Back at the station, Ramirez worked through the night to decrypt the ledger and analyze the data recovered from the state line warehouse. By morning, she had a breakthrough. "Aaron," she said, her voice urgent as he entered the lab. "We've got a problem." She turned her monitor toward him, displaying a decrypted message sent to Kane's burner phone just days before his arrest. The sender was listed as Cobra. The message read, "Shipment delayed. Ensure the package is secure. If compromised, terminate. We can't afford loose ends." Aaron's blood ran cold. They wanted him to kill her. Ramirez nodded grimly. Lila wasn't just a victim. They saw her as a liability. If Kane hadn't been caught, there's no telling what he would have done. Aaron clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "We need to find Cobra. This ends now." The next steps. The task force's focus shifted to identifying Cobra, the shadowy figure at the center of the operation. Using the evidence collected from both warehouses, Aaron and his team pieced together a clearer picture of the network structure. Cobra's messages suggested they operated with military precision, using layers of secrecy to protect their leaders. But Aaron was undeterred. He had seen the fear in Lila's eyes, the courage it took for her to speak up, and the hope she had placed in him. That hope was his fuel, driving him to keep pushing, keep fighting, until every child was safe and every predator brought to justice. As the team prepared for their next move, Aaron allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. They had come so far, but the road ahead was long and treacherous. Still, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Because this wasn't just a case, it was a mission. And failure wasn't an option. Aaron took a moment to process the magnitude of the situation. The message from Cobra sent chills down his spine, not just because of its cold calculation, but because of what it revealed about the organization. These weren't amateurs. They were disciplined, resourceful, and ruthless. Kane had been a cog in a much larger machine, and Cobra was likely one of its architects. He turned to Ramirez, who was already analyzing the data further. "Can we trace this message?" he asked. Ramirez shook her head. "Not easily. It was sent through a secure, encrypted network, something that looks military-grade. I'm working on it, but whoever Cobra is, they know how to cover their tracks." Aaron rubbed his temples. "What about the other sites we identified? Any signs they're still active?" Ramirez pulled up a map of locations connected to the trafficking network. "We've flagged 3 as high priority based on recent activity, but they're spread out across different states. If we want to hit them, we'll need federal coordination." Aaron's jaw tightened. They couldn't afford delays. Every moment they waited, more lives were at risk. He stepped away to call Captain Monroe, briefing her on the latest developments. A new lead. Hours later, as Aaron sat at his desk reviewing the ledger, Ramirez burst into the room, holding a piece of paper. "I found something," she said, excitement and urgency in her voice. Aaron looked up. "What is it?" Ramirez handed him the printout. "I decrypted part of the ledger. It's a schedule, and it includes drop-off and pickup locations. One of the entries matches a location we haven't checked yet, a storage facility about an hour from here." Aaron studied the document. The storage facility was listed under a shell company, with a recent timestamp indicating activity within the past 48 hours. If this was part of the operation, it could be their best chance to intercept the next phase. "Let's move," Aaron said, grabbing his jacket. He alerted Captain Monroe, who quickly authorized a team for the operation. The storage facility. The sun was setting as Aaron and his team arrived at the storage facility, a sprawling complex surrounded by a high chain-link fence. Rows of identical storage units stretched into the distance, their corrugated steel doors reflecting the fading light. Despite the mundane appearance, Aaron's instincts told him that they were in the right place. The team moved in quietly, splitting into pairs to cover more ground. Aaron led a group toward the units listed in the ledger. As they approached, he noticed something unusual. a faint hum of machinery coming from one of the units. "Here," he whispered, motioning for his team to stop. He crouched down and peered through the small ventilation slats in the door. Inside, he saw a makeshift command center, computer monitors, crates, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. More chillingly, there were photos taped to a wall, photos of children, including Lila. Aaron's pulse quickened. He signaled for the team to prepare to breach. With a swift motion, one officer used a bolt cutter to snap the lock, and they swung the door open. "Police! Hands up!" Aaron shouted as the team stormed inside. Two men inside the unit scrambled to grab something. A weapon, perhaps, but they froze when they saw the rifles trained on them. They raised their hands slowly, their faces pale with fear. Aaron approached one of the suspects, his voice sharp. "Who's Cobra? Where is he?" The man stammered, his eyes darting to the other suspect. We don't know. We just take orders." Aaron's patience wore thin. He grabbed the man by the collar and pulled him forward. "You better start talking, or your life is about to get a whole lot worse." The man swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his forehead. "All we know is that Cobra calls the shots. He sends the orders, and we follow them. That's it. I swear." Aaron let go, his mind racing. He turned to one of the officers. "Secure them and bag everything. We'll sort it out at the station." A message from Cobra. Back at the station, the evidence recovered from the storage unit provided a wealth of information. Ramirez and her team worked tirelessly to analyze the data, piecing together the inner workings of the network. As Aaron reviewed a series of recovered emails, his phone buzzed. It was Ramirez. "Blake, you need to see this," she said, her tone urgent. Aaron hurried to the cybercrime lab, where Ramirez pointed to her screen. "We intercepted another message from Cobra. It was sent after the raid of the storage unit. The message was brief but chilling. They're closing in. Relocate immediately. Secure all assets. No loose ends." Aaron's blood ran cold. "They're running." "Not just running," Ramirez said. "They're tying up loose ends. If they have any other victims in their custody, those kids are in immediate danger." Aaron slammed his fist on the desk. "We need to stop them now." Racing against time. With the message decrypted, Aaron's team identified a final location, an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. It was listed in the ledger as a fallback site, and the timestamp suggested recent activity. Aaron didn't hesitate. He mobilized his team, knowing this could be their last chance to catch Cobra and rescue any remaining victims. The drive to the farmhouse was tense, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on everyone. As they approached, the faint glow of lights inside confirmed they were in the right place. Aaron signaled for the team to surround the property. "On my count," he said into his radio. 3, 2, 1. The team moved in, breaching the farmhouse doors with a deafening crash. Inside, they found a scene of chaos. Papers scattered across the floor, computers smashed, and files burned. Whoever had been here had tried to cover their tracks. But in a locked room at the back of the house, they found 3 more children, huddled together and trembling. Aaron's heart broke at the sight, but he forced himself to stay focused. "You're safe now," he said gently as he approached them. "We're here to help." Cobra's shadow. Though the operation was a success, Cobra remained elusive. The evidence pointed to a sophisticated network with layers of anonymity protecting its leaders. But Aaron was undeterred. Every rescued child, every dismantled site, brought them closer to the truth. As he sat in his office that night, reviewing the day's events, Aaron received a call from Ramirez. "Blake," she said, her voice tired but determined. "We're closing in on Cobra. It's only a matter of time." Aaron nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "Then let's finish this." Cobra's lair. The morning sun cast its pale light over the police station, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Sergeant Aaron Blake sat at his desk, surrounded by papers, maps, and evidence files. He was running on little sleep, his mind consumed with thoughts of Cobra, the enigmatic leader of the trafficking ring. Every step they'd taken had brought them closer to dismantling the network, but Cobra remained an elusive shadow, orchestrating the operation with chilling precision. Detective Carla Ramirez entered the room, a tablet in hand and urgency in her stride. "Aaron," she said, setting the device on his desk, "we found something big." Aaron straightened, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" Ramirez tapped the screen, pulling up a satellite image of a secluded compound nestled deep in the woods, far from any major road or town. "This property belongs to one of the shell companies we've been tracking. It's isolated, heavily secured, and has been drawing large amounts of power despite its remote location. We believe this is where Cobra's operating from." Aaron studied the image, his jaw tightening. The compound was surrounded by dense forest, with a single dirt road leading in and out. It was the perfect place for someone like Cobra to hide. "Do we have intel on who's inside?" "Not much," Ramirez admitted, "but we intercepted communications suggesting they're preparing to relocate. If we don't move now, we could lose them." Aaron nodded, already reaching for his jacket. "Get Captain Monroe. We're going to need everything we've got." The final briefing. The task force gathered in the station's conference room, the air thick with anticipation. Captain Monroe stood at the front, her expression stern as she addressed the team. "This is it," she said, pointing to the map of the compound displayed on the screen. "We believe this is Cobra's base of operations. It's heavily fortified, and we have every reason to believe they'll resist. Our priority is the safety of any victims inside, but make no mistake, this will be dangerous." Aaron stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "We go in hard and fast. The element of surprise is on our side. Secure the perimeter, neutralize any threats, and get those kids out safely." The team nodded in unison, their determination evident. They had been working tirelessly for weeks, and now they were on the brink of a breakthrough. The assault. The convoy of police vehicles moved silently through the forest, their headlights off to avoid detection. The dirt road leading to the compound was rough and narrow, the trees closing in on either side. Aaron rode in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was unshakable. As the compound came into view, Aaron gave the signal. The vehicle stopped, and the officers disembarked, moving swiftly and silently to surround the perimeter. From their vantage points in the trees, they could see armed guards patrolling the grounds. Aaron spoke into his radio. "On my count. 3, 2, 1. The assault began with a deafening explosion as the tactical team breached the main gate. The guards scrambled in confusion, their shouts drowned out by the roar of gunfire. Aaron led his team through the chaos, his weapon drawn as they advanced toward the main building. Inside, the compound was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. Aaron passed rooms filled with surveillance equipment, maps, and documents, evidence of the network's vast reach. But it was the locked room at the end of the hallway that made his blood run cold. "Over here," he called, motioning for the team to join him. Using a battering ram, they forced the door open, revealing a room filled with cages. Inside were children of various ages, their faces pale and terrified. The sight was a gut-wrenching reminder of why they were there. "You're safe now," Aaron said, his voice gentle as he approached. "We're here to help." The children hesitated, their eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. But one by one, they began to step out of the cages, clutching each other as officers wrapped them in blankets and led them outside. Confronting Cobra. As the team secured the compound, Aaron received a radio call from one of the officers. "Blake, we've got something in the basement. You need to see this." Aaron hurried to the basement, his pulse quickening. The air grew colder as he descended the stairs, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. At the bottom, He found a sprawling underground command center filled with monitors, servers, and files. And there, in the center of it all, was Cobra. The man was seated at a desk, his back to Aaron as he worked on a laptop. He didn't flinch as Aaron and the officers entered, their weapons trained on him. "Hands where I can see them," Aaron commanded. Cobra turned slowly, a faint smirk on his face. He was older than Aaron had expected, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Well," he said, his voice calm, "you've been busy." Aaron stepped forward, his weapon steady. "You're under arrest. Stand up." Cobra raised his hands, his movements deliberate as he rose from his chair. "You think this is the end?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You've barely scratched the surface." Aaron ignored the taunt, cuffing Cobra and handing him off to the officers. "Get him out of here," he said. "I want everything in this room bagged and cataloged." Aftermath. The raid was a success. The compound was secured. Cobra was in custody. And the children were safe. But as Aaron sat in the station later that night, reviewing the evidence, he couldn't shake Cobra's words. The files recovered from the compound painted a chilling picture. Cobra's operation was just one branch of a larger network, and there were others out there, still operating in the shadows. Aaron knew their fight wasn't over. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. But amid the weariness was a sense of hope. They had saved lives that night, and they had struck a blow against a monstrous operation. It was a start. As he closed his eyes, he thought of Lila, the girl whose courage had set everything in motion. She was safe now, and so were the others. And as long as there were people like Cobra in the world, Aaron would keep fighting. Because that was what justice demanded. The war wasn't over, but the battle had been won, and Aaron was ready for whatever came next.